He believed he had won. New wife, perfect image, total control. But what he didn't know was that every lie, every hidden secret, every stolen dollar had already been uncovered. While he planned a wedding, she was preparing something far more powerful: the truth. This isn't about emotion, it's about timing, precision, and exposing everything at the exact moment it hurts the most. Because the most dangerous revenge is the one you never see coming. Like and share to support more stories like this. Thanks for watching.
The house was completely dark, the porch light deliberately turned off. On the coffee table, her wedding ring sat next to a note. It had only 5 words, but they were enough to destroy his entire world. Do not look for us. While he was celebrating Christmas Eve in Aspen with another woman, his wife had uncovered all his lies. She discovered the secret bank accounts, the hidden apartment, and the woman he had promised a future to. He never imagined this would happen. She did not scream. She did not break down. She simply took their 8-month-old twins and vanished into the night. What she does next will leave you speechless. If you believe that people get what they deserve and that justice will always prevail, then subscribe and watch this story until the very end. You will not be disappointed. The nursery was cold and felt painfully empty. Meredith Cowell stood in the doorway, holding 2 little Christmas stockings. They were decorated with tiny snowflakes and reindeer. Her fingers softly traced the names: Emmett and Nora, stitched in beautiful silver thread. "My sweet babies," she whispered into the silent room, her voice trembling. He did not just take away Christmas. He took away everything, and I had no idea. But that moment of painful realization would not come until much later. Our story actually begins on the morning of Christmas Eve, at a time when Meredith was certain her life was absolutely perfect. The Caldwell family home in Greenwich, Connecticut, was like a picture from a magazine. A fresh blanket of snow covered the perfectly manicured lawn. Every single window was adorned with a wreath and a velvet ribbon in the exact shade of dark red that her mother-in-law, Eleanor, insisted on every year. Inside, a massive 12-foot fir tree stood in the living room, sparkling with lights and ornaments collected by the Caldwell family for 3 generations. Meredith had been awake since 5 in the morning. The twins had finally started sleeping through the night, so she was using the quiet hours to prepare for the holiday. She baked gingerbread cookies from scratch and wrapped each present in elegant paper with flawless bows. She even laid out a set of matching pajamas for the family Christmas photo they were scheduled to take that evening. Everything had to be perfect, just as it always was. She was standing on a stepladder, making a final adjustment to the angel at the top of the tree, when she sensed him behind her. Garrett was in the doorway, already dressed in his expensive charcoal gray suit. He had his overnight bag packed and waiting. He looked polished and professional, the way he always did. "Are you leaving already?" Meredith asked as she carefully climbed down. "I thought your flight was not until noon." He walked toward her and gave her a quick, detached kiss on her forehead, avoiding her lips. She noticed, but she chose not to say anything. "I decided to drive instead," he said casually. "The weather report says the snow could get heavy later. It is better to leave early." She just nodded, but a strange, uneasy feeling began to twist in her stomach. Garrett was a man of strict routines. He never changed his plans. She knew that after 6 years of marriage. "Are you absolutely sure the clients could not reschedule?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "It is the twins' very first Christmas, Garrett." "They will not remember a thing, but I will," he replied with a heavy sigh. It was the sigh of a man who was tired of having the same conversation. "Meredith, we have already discussed this. The Henderson deal is worth $40 million in new business. If I can close this deal, our future is secure. I promise I will be back on Christmas night." She desperately wanted to argue with him. She wanted to remind him that she had given up her own promising career for him, that she had spent the last year in a fog of exhaustion from sleepless nights. She needed him to be there with her and the babies. But Meredith Kelwell was not a woman who started arguments. She was the one who always smoothed things over and made life easy for everyone. "All right," she said with a weak smile. "Just please drive safely." Garrett gave her the charming smile that had captured her heart at a charity gala 7 years earlier. He cupped her face in his hands and looked into her eyes with what she believed was genuine love. "I will absolutely make this up to you," he promised her. "New Year's in Turks and Caicos, just the 4 of us. The trip is already booked." She forced a small smile, allowing his promise to quiet her growing anxiety. "It is okay. Go and close your deal." He grabbed his car keys from the small table near the front door. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, quickly angled it away from her, and typed a hurried response. "That is the client now," he said smoothly. "I have to take this call from the car." She watched him walk away, wrapping her arms around herself to fight off a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Garrett," she called out just as he opened the door. He paused and turned back. "I love you." A peculiar expression flickered across his face for just a second. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was just irritation. "Love you too," he said, and then he was gone. For a long while, Meredith simply stood in the entryway. She listened to the crunch of the car's tires on the gravel driveway, and then the sound of the engine slowly faded into the distance. The house suddenly felt enormous and hollow, even with the twins sleeping soundly upstairs. She returned to the living room and adjusted a Christmas ornament that was already hanging perfectly. In the dim reflection of the window, she saw the face of a weary woman who looked much older than her 32 years. When had that happened? Just then, she heard Nora begin to cry from the nursery, pulling Meredith out of her thoughts. She rushed upstairs, grateful for the distraction. In the nursery, both babies were now fully awake. Their little faces were scrunched up, a clear sign that they were hungry. She picked up Nora first, and then Emmett, cradling them both against her chest, as she had done 1,000 times before. "Good morning, my sweethearts," she whispered. "Daddy had to go to work, but that is all right. We are going to have the most wonderful Christmas, just the 3 of us." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful, but it only came out sounding sad, as she settled into the rocking chair to feed them. Her eyes landed on the family portrait on the dresser. It was a photo from their wedding day. Garrett looked like the happiest man alive, and Meredith looked like she had won the lottery. She truly believed that she had. Her phone vibrated on the small table beside her. She reached for it with her free hand, assuming it was a text from Garrett. But it was from Suzanne, her closest friend. The message read, "Merry Christmas Eve. How are my 2 favorite little people?" Meredith typed back, "They are perfect." Garrett had to fly to Aspen for an unexpected business meeting. She watched the 3 little dots appear and then vanish as Suzanne composed a reply. A moment later, a new message arrived. It simply said, "Aspen for work? In December?" There was something about that simple question that made Meredith's stomach clench. She quickly replied, "Yes, it is a huge client meeting. You know how demanding his job can be." Suzanne's response was almost instant. "Of course. Give me a call when you have a free moment." Meredith set her phone down and tried to concentrate on her babies. They were nursing peacefully, their tiny fists opening and closing. She breathed in their sweet, milky scent and tried to push away the unsettling feeling that was growing inside her. "It is Christmas Eve," she told herself. "My husband loves me. Everything is fine." She repeated the words over and over again, like a prayer. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. But somewhere deep inside, a part of her already knew that it was not. Christmas Eve night arrived with a gentle snowfall that muffled the entire world in silence. The house felt vast and empty without Garrett's presence. Every small creak and groan of the old house seemed to echo in the quiet. Meredith had put the twins to sleep an hour ago, singing Silent Night to them until her own voice was hoarse. Now, she was completely alone in the living room. A glass of red wine sat on the coffee table beside her, untouched. The twinkling lights of the Christmas tree cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. She had tried calling Garrett twice, but each time the call went directly to his voicemail. She told herself he was probably tied up in a long dinner meeting. She told herself he would call her back the second he was free. She kept feeding herself these little reassurances to keep the rising tide of panic at bay. Her laptop was on the ottoman, where she had left it earlier. The screen was still open to the photo editing software she had been using for their family Christmas card. Now, she picked it up with a different purpose. She wanted to upload some recent pictures of the twins enjoying their first snow day to their shared family cloud account. Garrett's mother had been asking to see them. It was a simple, mindless task, something to keep her hands occupied while her thoughts were spiraling. She opened her web browser and navigated to the family's cloud storage drive. And that is when she saw something that made her entire body freeze. Garrett's personal email account was still logged in from the last time he had used her laptop. His inbox was right there on her screen, with several new messages highlighted in red. Meredith hesitated. In all their years together, she had never once invaded his privacy by looking at his emails. She truly believed that their marriage was built on a foundation of complete and total trust. But her friend's skeptical words echoed in her mind. Aspen for work? In December. Her hand trembled as she moved the cursor and clicked on his inbox. The very first email at the top of the list was a reservation confirmation from a 5-star luxury resort in Aspen. Her heart began to pound in her chest as she opened it. The reservation was for a romantic winter getaway package for 2 adults. Check-in was for December 24th, with a checkout on December 26th. The reservation was under the name Garrett Caldwell, and the second guest was listed as Vanessa Holt. The words on the screen started to swim. Meredith blinked hard, convinced she must be misreading it. She scrolled down and found more emails, an entire history stretching back for months. There were dinner reservations for 2. It began with digital receipts for jewelry from shops she did not recognize. Then she found a rental agreement for a city apartment that was signed 6 months ago. Her hands trembled so fiercely the laptop nearly tumbled from her lap. She set it on the table, covered her face, and fought to breathe, to think. This had to be a mistake. Garrett would never do this. He was in love with her, but her fingers had a will of their own. She opened a new window and typed a name into the search bar. Vanessa Holt. The very first result was a professional profile. Vanessa Holt worked as an executive assistant for Garrett Caldwell. The profile picture showed a self-assured, smiling woman in her late 20s with gorgeous dark hair. Meredith's stomach dropped as she clicked on the woman's public Instagram page. The most recent post was only a few hours old. It showed a glass of champagne held up against a backdrop of snowy mountains. The caption read, "Some gifts are worth the wait," followed by a diamond ring symbol. Meredith enlarged the photo. A very delicate gold bracelet was on the woman's wrist. Meredith knew it immediately. 6 months earlier, she had pointed out that exact bracelet in a store window. Garrett had claimed it was much too expensive, yet there it was, on another woman's arm, in a picture. Have you ever discovered a secret that shattered your entire world? If you understand that feeling, type the word truth in the comments below. Meredith's glass of wine sat forgotten as she sank deeper and deeper into the evidence of her husband's secret life. She found credit card statements for an account he had kept hidden from her. She discovered text messages he had backed up to his email, conversations so intimate they made her feel sick. A message from 3 weeks ago made her blood run cold. It was sent the day before Thanksgiving. A woman named Vanessa had written, "When are you going to leave her?" Garrett's response was horribly clear. After the holidays, I need to get my finances in order first. She has no idea. Meredith read his words again and again, until they blurred into nonsense. She has no idea. The mountain of lies was so high, it blocked out the sun on her entire life. The secret apartment in Tribeca, the other woman, all of it was real. With shaking hands, she dialed Garrett's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice sharp and annoyed. "What is it?" "I am in a meeting." She could hear music and laughter in the background. She could also hear a woman's voice, though she could not understand the words. "Garrett, who are you with?" Meredith asked, her own voice barely a whisper. "I am with my colleagues," he snapped. "Mary, do not be so paranoid. I will call you tomorrow." Meredith persisted. "Garrett, I really have to talk to you." He let out a loud, irritated sigh. "Whatever it is, it can wait. I am speaking with very important people." "More important than I am?" She wanted to scream. "More important than our children?" But the words were stuck in her throat. She heard the woman laugh again, much closer to the phone this time. In that single moment, something inside of Meredith shattered completely. "Owen, I need to go," Garrett said into the phone. "Merry Christmas." And then the connection was gone. Meredith sat in the deafening silence for a long time. The Christmas tree lights blinked on and off in their simple, cheerful pattern, completely unaware that a life was falling apart right in front of them. Then, she slowly rose to her feet. She climbed the stairs and went into the nursery. The twins were sound asleep in their cribs, their faces calm and free of any worry. Meredith slid to the floor between them and hugged her knees to her chest. That is when the tears began to fall, silent but relentless. She cried until her body ached, until she had no tears left. She cried for the life she thought she had, for the man she thought she knew, and for the future she had dreamed of, which was now dissolving like a snowflake. When the crying finally stopped, a new feeling took its place. It was not sadness or anger. It was perfect clarity. She picked up her phone and called her friend Suzanne, who answered on the first ring. "Mary, what is wrong?" Meredith's voice was surprisingly steady, far stronger than she felt. "I need your help. Garrett has been lying to me. He has been lying about every single thing." Suzanne arrived at the Grenache Chateau just as the sun was about to rise on Christmas morning. Her car was packed with supplies, and her lawyer's brain was already working through every option. Neither of them had slept at all. They sat together at the kitchen table, talking in quiet voices, while the twins slept upstairs. As the first soft light of Christmas Day streamed through the windows, Suzanne was all business. "Show me everything you found." Meredith slid her laptop over. She had spent the entire night downloading files, taking screenshots and creating a perfect record of her husband's betrayal. It was not the Christmas she had imagined, but it would be the Christmas that would make her free. Suzanne examined the evidence in silence, her expression growing more grim with each photo and document. The apartment lease, the receipts for expensive gifts, the text messages laid out a detailed plan for a future that did not include Meredith. At last, Suzanne looked up. "This is bad, Mary. This is incredibly bad." "I know," Meredith said. "No," Suzanne replied. "You do not get it. These bank statements show he is hiding money from you. A very large amount of money. If he is doing what I suspect, you need to move very, very fast." Meredith's fingers tightened around her cold coffee cup. "What are you talking about?" Suzanne leaned forward. "Men like Garrett do not just leave. They make a plan. They make sure they walk away with everything. By the time their spouse finds out, the money is all gone. The prenuptial agreement is solid, and she is left with nothing at all." Meredith spoke quietly. "We did not sign a prenuptial agreement. He said he trusted me." Suzanne gave a short, harsh laugh. "Of course he did. He knew exactly what that meant. A prenup would have offered you some protection. Without one, he can try to take everything in the divorce. But it also means you are entitled to half of everything, if you can prove that it exists. Meredith could only stare at the proof on the screen. So, what do I do? Suzanne answered instantly. You have to leave. Today, right now, before he comes home and realizes that you know. Leave and go where? Meredith asked, her voice trembling. My family has a cabin in Vermont. It has been empty for years. There is no paper trail leading to it, and nobody outside of our family knows it is there. Meredith slowly shook her head. I cannot just run off with the twins. That is kidnapping. It is not kidnapping if you are their mother, and there is no custody order from a court. You have every right to take your children wherever you want. What you do not have, Suzanne said firmly, is time. Those words seemed to freeze in the air. Meredith looked around the stunning kitchen that she had designed. She looked at the custom-made cabinets. She looked at the marble counters and the professional-grade appliances. She had put her heart into making this house a home, only to realize it was never truly hers. If I go, she said softly, nothing will ever be the same. I can never come back. Suzanne reached across the table and took her hand. Do you want to come back? Do you want to be with a man who lied to you for months? A man who has another woman living in an apartment that you helped pay for without even knowing it? Meredith saw Garrett's face in her mind. She thought of the champagne, the bracelet. She remembered the irritation in his voice on the phone. He spoke to her as if she were a problem he needed to solve. No, she whispered. I do not want to go back. Good. Then we need to start moving, Suzanne said. They worked quickly and efficiently. Meredith packed only the essentials, following Suzanne's precise list. Birth certificates, passports, social security cards, the twins' health records. The only personal thing she packed was her grandmother's jewelry, the one item that was completely hers. She left behind all her clothes and pictures. She took only what was needed for a new beginning. Suzanne handled the logistics. She had Meredith get cash from her personal bank account at a machine. It was an account that Garrett never paid attention to. She bought a prepaid phone at a convenience store. She mapped out a route that used only country roads to make it harder for them to be tracked. As Meredith put the final bag into her car, she paused at the doorway of the living room. The Christmas tree was still lit up, its lights blinking in their happy repeating pattern. The stockings were still hanging by the fireplace, and the gifts she had wrapped so lovingly were piled underneath the tree. She walked to the coffee table and slipped off her wedding ring. She placed it on the dark wood surface. Next, she tore a page from a notepad and wrote only 6 words. Do not try to find us. She put the note beside the ring and walked out, not once looking back. She gently buckled the sleepy twins into their car seats. Emmett grabbed for her finger playfully as she secured his straps. Nora gave a tiny yawn and drifted back to sleep. Meredith leaned over and kissed each of their foreheads. We are going on an adventure, she whispered to them. Just the 3 of us. She slid into the driver's seat and looked over at Suzanne. Are you certain about this cabin? Suzanne nodded. I am sending you the address, Suzanne said. Get rid of your old phone. Do not reach out to anyone from your past life. I will handle everything on this end. Meredith gave a small nod. Thank you for doing all of this. You can properly thank me once you are truly free, Suzanne told her. Meredith twisted the key, and the engine rumbled to life. She glanced one last time at the house she had considered home for 4 years. It was a picture-perfect house for a picture-perfect life that had been nothing but a beautiful lie. Then she shifted the car into drive and disappeared into the gloomy Christmas morning. She was leaving it all behind, except for the 2 small children who meant everything to her. As she drove off, a fresh layer of snow began to fall from the sky. It quickly covered the tracks from her tires, erasing any sign that she had ever been there. Garrett Caldwell arrived home on Christmas night to a house that was completely dark. The first thing he saw was that the porch light was out. Meredith always made sure to leave it on for him. It was one of her small, thoughtful habits, the kind of detail she cherished, even though he never gave it a second thought. But tonight, the porch was dark and unwelcoming. A wave of unease washed over him as he guided his car into the driveway. His private flight from Aspen had been turbulent. The small aircraft had been shaken and battered by the winter storm. During the flight, Garrett had tried to nurse a headache from too much champagne while thinking about his weekend. Vanessa had been annoyed that he had to go home so soon. She had wanted him to remain with her until the New Year's, but maintaining the right image was crucial. Garrett Caldwell was always very concerned with appearances. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. In the living room, the Christmas tree was still glowing. Its vibrant lights cast dancing shadows across the walls of the quiet home. "Meredith," he called, "I am back." But the only answer he received was silence. He set his bag on the floor and walked into the living room. Everything appeared to be flawless. The decorations were perfectly placed, the gifts were arranged under the tree, and the sofa pillows were neatly fluffed. Then his gaze fell upon the coffee table. Her wedding ring sat there beside a folded piece of paper, sparkling in the tree's colorful lights. Garrett's hands began to tremble as he reached for the note. "Do not try to find us." He read the words over and over, but they made no sense. He let the paper slip from his fingers and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The nursery was deserted. The two empty cribs stood there like silent accusations. The blankets on the twin beds were folded with precision, but the babies who should have been sleeping soundly in them were gone. Garrett yanked open the dresser drawers, only to find them half empty. The diaper bag was nowhere to be found. The baby carriers were also missing. He grabbed his phone and dialed Meredith's number. It rang only once before the call went to her voicemail. He tried a second time and got the same result. His hand shook as he looked through his contact list to call his mother. Eleanor picked up on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert, even at such a late hour. "Garrett, is there a problem?" He could hardly speak. "She left. Meredith," he stammered into the phone. "She took the twins and she left." A short pause followed, and then Eleanor's voice turned as hard as ice. "What do you mean, she left?" "I got home, and the house was empty. She left her ring and a note telling me not to look for her. The babies are gone, too." "I understand," Eleanor said, her tone as frigid as the winter wind. "Garrett, what did you do?" "I did not do anything. I have no idea why she would just leave." "Do not lie to me," she snapped back. "I am not your naive wife." Garrett sank onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. He thought of the emails and the text messages, the evidence he had been so sure he had hidden perfectly. "She knows," he finally confessed. "She found out about Vanessa." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was cold enough to freeze water. "You foolish, foolish man. I tried to warn you about that woman." "I had the situation under control. Obviously you did not. Do you have any clue where Meredith might have gone?" Garrett's thoughts scrambled through a haze of panic. Her parents had passed away, and she did not have a large circle of friends. Suzanne Brennan had been her maid of honor, but Meredith had not spoken about her in years. "Maybe Suzanne," he suggested. "They were inseparable in college." "In that case, you must find Suzanne and learn what she knows," his mother instructed. "I will start making some calls. We need to contain this situation before it erupts into a public embarrassment." Garrett nodded, even though his mother could not see him. A new feeling was starting to build in his chest. It was not guilt, and it was not regret. It was pure, unfiltered rage. How could she just walk out? How could she take his children and run away without letting him explain, without letting him fix the problem? He had given her everything. a magnificent house, a high social standing, a life of complete comfort. And this was how she repaid him? "Mother," he said, his own voice becoming cold and sharp, "I want them brought back. Do whatever is necessary." Eleanor's reply was immediate and firm. "I have connections. Very discreet people. We will handle this." After hanging up, Garrett sat by himself in the silent nursery. He was surrounded by the toys and furniture of a family that had just vanished into thin air. The small mobile above Emmett's crib spun slowly in a draft, playing a gentle, tinkling melody that made his jaw clench. He picked up his phone to make another call. Vanessa answered, sounding out of breath. "Honey, I was not expecting you to call until tomorrow." "There has been a change of plans," Garrett said in a flat voice. "She knows," Garrett said plainly. "She took the children and disappeared." There was a brief silence on the line. "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do?" "You are not going to do anything," he commanded. "You will stay out of it and let me take care of things. Is that clear?" "Yes, of course. Anything you need." Garrett ended the call without saying another word. He went back downstairs and poured himself a large glass of scotch, downing it in one smooth, burning motion. Meredith really believed she could just escape from him. She thought she could take his children and simply vanish, as if he were some ordinary man she could easily discard. She was making a terrible mistake. Garrett Caldwell never, ever lost. Not in business, not in his personal life, and definitely not in his marriage. He picked up his phone to make one final call. This call was to a man who specialized in finding people who did not wish to be found. "I require your services," he said. "My wife has left with our children. I need to have her location within 48 hours. The man on the other end stated his fee. Garrett did not hesitate for a second. "Done. I will pay whatever it costs." He hung up and stared at the Christmas tree. Its joyful lights seemed to be mocking him in the middle of his ruined, perfect world. She was going to learn her lesson. In the end, they always did. No one ever just walked away from Garrett Caldwell. The cabin in Vermont was located at the end of a long, unpaved road that had not been cleared in weeks. Deep snow was piled high in the driveway, which meant Meredith had to park about 50 yards away. She was forced to carry her twin babies through snowdrifts that reached her knees. By the time she managed to get them all inside, her legs were sore and her lungs ached from breathing in the frigid air. But the cabin was solid, warm, and most importantly, safe. It had been in Suzanne's family for 3 generations. It was a simple place, with no internet and very little cell phone reception, but it had running water and a working fireplace. The pantry was also filled with enough canned goods to get them through several weeks. Meredith gently set the twins down on an old, comfortable couch and took a look at the beginning of her new life. The first 3 days were a complete fog. She was consumed by feeding schedules, long sleepless nights, and a level of exhaustion so profound that it was difficult to think clearly. She kept all the curtains drawn, flinched at every unfamiliar sound, and double-checked the locks on the doors before she went to sleep. But after a few days, something inside of her slowly started to shift. On the 4th morning, she was awakened by a sliver of sunlight shining through the curtains and the sound of Emmett giggling in his crib. Nora was also awake, happily chattering to herself as she stared at the ceiling. Meredith stayed in bed for a moment, just listening to the sweet sounds of her children. For the first time in many months in this quiet, secluded cabin, she felt a feeling she had almost forgotten, a sense of peace. Later that day, Suzanne showed up in a car loaded with groceries and a stack of legal papers. She knocked the snow from her boots and wrapped Meredith in a long, comforting hug before she spoke. "You look better," she finally said. "You do not look like a ghost anymore." "I feel better," Meredith answered. "It is odd. I was so worried I would completely fall apart when I got here." Suzanne set a thick pile of folders onto the kitchen table. "That is because you have been slowly falling apart for years," she said with a gentle voice. "You just were not able to see it because you were so busy trying to keep everything else from collapsing." They sat together at the table while the twins napped, spreading the documents across the rustic wooden surface. It was clear that Suzanne had been working hard. There were bank statements from secret accounts, property deeds that Meredith had never known about, and proof of financial misdeeds that went far beyond his affair. "He has been funneling money into offshore accounts for more than a year," Suzanne explained. "He is using shell corporations in the Cayman Islands to make investments that are not listed on any of your shared financial records. If he were to file for divorce, he would declare that he has no money, and you would be left with practically nothing." Meredith could only stare at the figures printed on the pages. "How much money are we talking about?" "Our best estimate is somewhere between $12 to $15 million, all of it hidden." The amount was staggering. Meredith knew they were comfortable, but she never imagined they possessed this level of wealth. "There is something else," Suzanne said, her tone becoming serious. "I looked into Vanessa Holt. She is not just his assistant. She has been receiving money from his private account for 3 years, at a salary that makes no sense for any legitimate job. Or a model." "What are you trying to say?" Meredith asked. "I am saying he pays her for more than just organizing his calendar. I also found a lease for an apartment in her name. It seems she has been waiting a very long time for him to leave you." A cold wave of nausea washed over Meredith. She thought of all those nights he was supposedly working late at the office. She remembered all of his business trips. She had given him her complete trust, and he had used it as a tool to deceive her. "So what is our next move?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We repair our case," Suzanne said with determination. "We record every single detail. Then, when the moment is right, we will take him down in court." For the first time since that terrible night, Meredith felt something besides fear. A small, hot ember of anger started to glow within her. She gazed down at the pile of evidence on the table, then looked up at her friend, Suzanne. "Just tell me exactly what I need to do." They spent hours organizing the documents and building their strategy. Suzanne patiently explained all the legal pathways. She used simple language Meredith could follow, discussing things like divorce filings, finding hidden money, and fights over the children. By the time they finished, the sun had disappeared. The twins were awake and crying for their dinner. Meredith took care of the babies, while Suzanne made a simple meal from canned food she found in the pantry. Much later that night, the children were asleep, and a fire was crackling in the fireplace. They sat together in the quiet darkness. "I really thought I would miss him," Meredith admitted in a low voice. "This house, the life we built, but I just do not." "You miss the dream of what you wanted it to be," Suzanne replied gently, "not the reality of what it was." Meredith nodded her head slowly. "I cannot stop thinking about all the warning signs I chose to ignore. I remember all the times I convinced myself I was just being crazy or unappreciative." "That was not your fault," Suzanne said firmly. "He was an expert at lying." They sat quietly for a minute. Then Suzanne spoke again. "You are aware he is searching for you, right? His mother has powerful friends and a lot of money." "I know," Meredith whispered. "Does that scare you?" Meredith considered the question. She saw Garrett's face in her mind and the cold, empty look in his eyes. She thought about his mother, a woman who never approved of her and always made her feel like an inconvenience. "Yes," she finally said, "but the thought of going back scares me a lot more." "Good," Suzanne responded. "Remember that feeling." Outside, snow began to fall, wrapping the world in a silent, white blanket. Meredith looked at her children, sleeping soundly in the crib Suzanne had set up. For the first time, she let herself picture a life that did not have Garrett Caldwell in it. The idea was frightening, but it was also thrilling. It tasted like freedom. She whispered to herself, "Everything is going to be all right." At that exact moment, the silence was shattered. The low growl of car engines became louder and louder. Blinding headlights sliced through the dark, sweeping across the bedroom ceiling like searchlights looking for a fugitive. Meredith's newfound hope turned to ice. They had found her. Her heart pounded like a drum against her ribs. She snatched the phone and dialed Suzanne, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold on. "They are outside," she managed to say. But Suzanne's voice was completely steady. "I know, Meredith. I made a phone call of my own. A friend of mine from the state police is on his way there now to perform a wellness check. Just stay calm." A few moments later, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. Meredith peeked through the curtains and saw a police officer in uniform speaking to two threatening men who stood beside a black sport utility vehicle. The officer's presence was a barrier. The men argued, but they had no power. They eventually drove off, completely defeated. The very next morning, Garrett was officially served with divorce papers. He also received a restraining order that completely froze all of his money and property. His perfect life fell apart in an instant. Meredith did not just get away. She had won. Many months later, in a bright new house far from her old life, she watched her twins happily playing. They were finally safe and finally free. She knew she had discovered the strength to create a wonderful new life from the ashes of her old one. The phone rang one time, then a second, then a third before the call went to voicemail. She tried calling one more time. Her fingers were shaking so violently that the phone almost slipped from her grasp. It happened again. Outside, she could see shapes moving toward the cabin. The beams of their flashlights cut through the night like sharp blades. Meredith counted 4 of them. 2 men wore police uniforms, and 2 were in street clothes. She heard the crunch of their footsteps on the frozen snow. Every sound was like another nail of panic being hammered into her heart. She guessed she had about 3 minutes. She rushed over to the twins, who were still sound asleep in their cribs. She tried to solve an impossible problem about how to get away. The cabin had no back door. There was no other exit. None of the windows were big enough for her to climb through while carrying 2 babies. Every path to escape led straight to the people who were coming to get her. Think. You have to think. Her mind raced, desperately looking for a solution that did not exist. She could try hiding in the closet, but they would easily find her. She could just refuse to open the door, but they would simply break it down. There was no way she could fight 4 people, especially when 2 of them were armed. A loud, forceful knock boomed through the small cabin like a gunshot. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is the police. Please open the door." Meredith stood frozen in the center of the room. She held her babies tightly in her arms. She could only take short, panicked breaths. Emmett moved against her chest, bothered by the frantic beating of her heart. Nora made a soft whimper in her sleep. Meredith understood. She had nowhere to run. She understood. She had nowhere to hide. The only thing she could do was wait. Another knock came, louder this time. "Mrs. Caldwell, we are aware you are inside. Open the door now, or we will have to force our way in." Meredith walked very slowly toward the door. Each step felt like she was walking toward her own doom. She shifted the twins so they rested in the curve of one arm. With a hand that refused to stop shaking, she reached out for the knob and pulled the door open. Eleanor Caldwell was the first to step inside. She was wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere coat and had a look of cold triumph on her face. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, even in the middle of the night. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like a woman who had never faced a single hardship in her entire life. 2 uniformed officers, with emotionless, professional expressions, stood behind her, along with a man Meredith did not recognize. He was a large man with a shaved head and cold, empty eyes. He looked around the cabin with an expert's gaze. "Did you honestly believe you could hide from us?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was full of contempt. "In a cabin that belongs to your old college roommate's family? It took us 3 days to find you, Meredith. Just 3 days. Did you really think you could outsmart our family?" Meredith held her babies even tighter. Their body heat was the only thing that felt real at that moment. "How did you—" "Money, my dear. Money can find anything." Eleanor's smile was like a razor-sharp, cruel blade. "My son has already filed for emergency custody of the children. These officers are here to ensure that you obey the court's decision." "A court decision? What court decision? No one has given me any papers." One of the police officers stepped forward. He held out a folded set of documents, and his badge gleamed in the faint light. "Mrs. Caldwell, your husband was granted an emergency custody order. It was based on concerns for your mental stability and the welfare of the children. You are ordered to be in a Connecticut courtroom within 72 hours. "Mental stability? Meredith's voice broke. "That is absurd. I am their mother. I have never done a single thing to harm them." "A mother who flees in the middle of the night with 2 babies," Eleanor cut in smoothly. "A mother who deserts her home without telling anyone, who brings her children to a faraway cabin where no one can contact them. That is not how a stable person acts, Meredith. That is how someone who is having a severe mental breakdown acts." "I found out he was cheating on me," Meredith yelled, her voice getting louder despite her efforts to remain calm. "He has been with another woman for months. He has been hiding our money. He has been lying to me about his entire life. I left to keep myself and my children safe." Eleanor did not even flinch. Her face remained perfectly still and under control. "Do you see, officers? She is having paranoid delusions. She thinks everyone is out to get her. It is exactly what we stated in the court documents." The heavy-set man spoke for the very first time. His voice was dull and businesslike. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Frank Donovan. I am a private investigator. Your husband hired me to locate you and the children. This does not have to be a messy situation. If you come back peacefully and follow the legal system, we can handle all of this in the correct way." Meredith looked from him to the officers and then to Eleanor. She scanned their faces, hoping to find a hint of sympathy, any tiny sign that they might actually believe her. She saw nothing. She only saw cold confidence and immense power. She saw the total certainty of people who were sure they had already won. "What other choice do I have?" she whispered. "You have 72 hours to be in a Connecticut court," the officer said again. "If you fail to appear, a warrant will be issued for your arrest for custodial interference. Your children will be given to their father's care until the hearing." Meredith's world was caving in. In just a few minutes, everything she had struggled to build over the last week was gone. The safety, the hope, the tiny glimmer of freedom. It all vanished. Eleanor moved closer, and the smell of her expensive perfume filled the small cabin, making it hard to breathe. Her voice became a venomous whisper, meant only for Meredith's ears. "Come home without a fight, and Garrett might have some pity on you, but if you make a scene, if you drag this through the courts and into the public eye, I will personally see to it that you never lay eyes on those babies again. Do you understand me?" Meredith's gaze fell to Emmett and Nora. They were sleeping so soundly, completely unaware of the storm raging around them. They had no idea their entire lives were being bartered away by people who treated them like possessions. For a moment, she considered fighting. She thought about making a run for it. She wanted to scream for help until someone, anyone, would listen to her. But she knew Eleanor was right. Their money could reach anywhere, and Meredith had nothing. She had no way to fight back, no influential friends, and no power. "Fine," she said, the word feeling like sharp little pieces of glass in her throat. "I will come back." A cruel, triumphant smile spread across Eleanor's face. I knew you'd see reason. You were always such a sensible girl. As an officer stood by and watched her pack, Meredith felt numb. Donovan carried her bags to their big car while Eleanor fussed over the twins, as if they were trophies she had just claimed. In that moment, Meredith made a quiet vow to herself. This was not the end. She might have lost this fight, but the war was far from over, and she would burn their entire world to the ground before she let them take her children for good. The Greenwich family courthouse was a grim gray building with tall, imposing windows. American flags hung, limp and still, in the frigid January air. Inside, the sound of footsteps echoed on polished marble floors, mixing with the low hum of hushed conversations. The place smelled of old paper and harsh cleaning chemicals. Meredith sat on a hard wooden bench just outside courtroom 3. She twisted her hands together in her lap. Next to her, her lawyer, Suzanne, scanned the legal papers, her expression growing angrier by the second. This is a complete setup, Suzanne whispered fiercely. Judge Harrison Webb has been a friend of the Caldwell family for 30 years. He was a guest at their wedding. For goodness sake, he has to recuse himself from this case. He will not, Meredith replied, her voice empty of all emotion. They have planned for everything. I can still file a motion. It will just be denied. Then we will appeal it. With what money, Sue? I have absolutely nothing. He has frozen every single one of my accounts. Suzanne looked at her friend, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Meredith saw genuine doubt in her eyes. She saw the raw fear of what they were truly up against. Just then, the large courtroom doors swung open. A bailiff stepped out and announced their case number. Meredith's legs trembled as she stood up and walked into the room that held her fate. It was smaller than she expected, with a threatening kind of intimacy. Garrett was already sitting at the opposing table with his lawyer. His attorney was a woman named Pamela Thornton, whose reputation alone was a terrifying weapon. She was notorious for systematically destroying her opponents with ice-cold efficiency. Garrett refused to even look at Meredith. He stared straight ahead, his posture perfect, playing the part of the devoted husband who had been terribly wronged. His mother, Eleanor, sat right behind him. She watched Meredith with the chilling satisfaction of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. And sitting beside Eleanor, in a tasteful and professional dress that only highlighted her beauty, was Vanessa Holt. The sight of her nearly made Meredith's knees buckle. She was actually here. She was sitting in this very courtroom, watching Meredith fight for her own children, while wearing her affair with Garrett like it was a Medal of Honor. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Webb. The judge entered the room. He was an older man with white hair and steel-rimmed glasses. He wore an expression that said he had made his decision long before he sat down. He gave Pamela Thornton a small nod before his eyes even flickered toward Meredith and her lawyer. We are here today to discuss the emergency custody petition filed by Garrett Caldwell regarding the minor children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell. Mrs. Thornton, you may begin. Pamela stood, her voice polished and full of confidence. Your Honor, my client is gravely concerned for the welfare of his children. On December 25th, his wife, Meredith Caldwell, abandoned the family home in the dead of night. She took the children to an unknown location without any prior warning or any attempt to communicate. Meredith felt a scream building in her chest. She wanted to jump to her feet and tell everyone the truth. She wanted to expose the affair, the secret bank accounts, and the years of deception. But Suzanne put a firm hand on her arm, a silent command to remain seated. We have also acquired a psychiatric evaluation, Pamela continued, holding up a file. It indicates that Mrs. Caldwell may be suffering from postpartum psychosis. The evaluating physician, Dr. Robert Matthews, is prepared to testify. He will state that her recent behavior is consistent with delusional thinking and that she poses a potential risk to her children. Meredith leaned over to Suzanne and whispered desperately, "I have never met that doctor in my life." "I know," Suzanne whispered back. "We will object." But when Suzanne stood up to voice the objection, Judge Webb simply waved his hand dismissively. The evaluation was ordered out of Mr. Caldwell's concern for his children's safety. The next hour was a dizzying nightmare of twisted truths and outright lies. Vanessa took the witness stand, introducing herself as Mr. Caldwell's executive assistant. She then tearfully described how she had observed Meredith's behavior, becoming more and more erratic over the last year. "She seemed so paranoid," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "She would accuse Mr. Caldwell of the most unbelievable things. I even witnessed her have several angry outbursts at company events." Meredith could only stare at the woman who was sleeping with her husband. This woman was now committing perjury to help steal Meredith's children, and an icy coldness spread through Meredith's veins. When her lawyer, Suzanne, tried to present evidence of the affair, Judge Webb cut her off. He declared, "This is a custody hearing, Mrs. Brennan, not a divorce proceeding. Mr. Caldwell's private affairs are not relevant to the children's well-being." "Your Honor," Suzanne pressed, "his profound dishonesty speaks directly to his character and his fitness as a parent." The judge's response was swift. "Objection sustained. Please move on." But they had nowhere to move. Every single piece of evidence Meredith had painstakingly gathered was dismissed or ignored. Every argument Suzanne tried to build was torn down. It was painfully obvious that the verdict had been decided before they ever walked into the courtroom. The judge delivered his ruling with cold, swift brutality. "Based on the testimony and evidence presented," Judge Webb announced, "I am awarding temporary full custody of the minor children to their father, Mr. Garrett Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell will be granted supervised visitation twice a week, pending a full custody hearing." "No!" Meredith gasped, rising to her feet. "No, you cannot do this. He is lying. Every single one of them is lying." The judge's voice was stern. "Mrs. Caldwell, control yourself, or I will have you removed from my courtroom." "Please," she cried, her voice breaking. "Please do not do this. They are my babies. I am their mother." But it was no use. 2 court officers were already moving toward her. Garrett was standing up, and his mother, Eleanor, was already reaching for the twins, who were still in their car seats. Meredith watched in absolute horror as the people who had systematically ruined her life carried her children away. Her daughter, Nora, looked back over Eleanor's shoulder. Her little face was crumpled with confusion as she reached out a tiny hand for her mommy. Meredith collapsed against Suzanne, a broken, animal-like sound escaping her lips. She had lost. They had stripped her of everything that mattered, and she was completely powerless to stop it. The motel room reeked of stale cigarettes and despair. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners like dry, flaking skin. The carpet was covered in stains that Meredith tried not to look at too closely. On the ceiling, a large brown water stain looked like a map to a miserable, forgotten land. But the room was only $39 a night, and she had just $847 to her name. It had been 3 weeks since that devastating day in court. 3 weeks of seeing her babies in cold, sterile rooms under the glare of fluorescent lights. For 2 hours at a time, she sat on a hard plastic chair and held her children while a court-appointed stranger documented her every move. She spent 3 miserable weeks sleeping in rundown motels that accepted cash and did not require identification. For 3 weeks, she lived on gas station snacks and bitter coffee from vending machines. She desperately tried to find a way forward, but every single option was a dead end. Garrett's team of lawyers had been ruthlessly efficient. They had frozen their joint bank accounts, claiming they feared she would spend all their money recklessly. They had legally barred her from entering her own home. They claimed the house was a marital asset now tied up in the divorce proceedings. They even twisted the fact that she had fled with the children, arguing that leaving the state was proof of her instability as a mother. They had systematically dismantled her life, piece by piece, until absolutely nothing was left. And today, she had received the most crushing blow yet. Meredith sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at the legal documents Suzanne had emailed her that morning. The opened envelope lay on the nightstand. Its pages were spread across the faded bedspread, like the grim evidence of a terrible crime. The one person who could save them, Garrett's former secretary, Tina Marshall, had just betrayed them. She changed her entire story in a new legal document. In it, she claimed Meredith had paid her to lie about Mr. Caldwell. The statement was formal, official, and it ruined their whole case. "He paid her off," Suzanne said, over the phone, her voice completely hollow. "I do not know how much he offered her, but it was enough. She was our only real chance to prove he was a monster." Meredith asked, "What happened with the federal investigation?" "It got shut down," Suzanne replied. "Judge Webb is not leaving the case, and our complaint against him is going nowhere. Meredith, his friends have a lot of power. I have never seen anything like it." "So, what is my next move?" Meredith asked. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. "I do not know," Suzanne said at last. "I have no more ideas. I am so terribly sorry." After Meredith ended the call, she sat in silence for hours. Life went on outside her window, as if her world had not just fallen apart. Cars sped down the highway, their headlights slicing through the gray afternoon. Across the street, a diner's neon sign blinked on and off. It was advertising fresh coffee and pie. Somewhere in the world, people were going about their day. They worried about ordinary things. They were hugging their kids without a stranger watching their every single move. She grabbed her phone and opened a news app, her thumb scrolling past headlines she did not bother to read. But then, a story at the top of the page made her feel sick. It said, "Record-breaking quarter for Caldwell Capital, firm announces expansion." The article had a photo of the Garrett at a press conference. He stood at a podium with his company's logo on it, looking powerful, rich, and completely unaffected by the chaos he had caused. His suit was expensive. His smile was wide. He looked like a man who had never faced a single challenge in his life, and standing right beside him was Vanessa. Her hand was placed on a small baby bump, barely visible beneath her designer dress. She was glowing with that special light that pregnant women have. It was the same light Meredith once had, before her entire life was destroyed. The caption below the photo read, "Caldwell with his fiancée Vanessa Holt, who are expecting their first child." Meredith's eyes stayed on those words. Expecting their first child. Their first child. It was like her own son and daughter, Emmett and Nora, had been completely erased. It felt as if they were just a footnote in Garrett's history, instead of the center of her universe. She pictured her babies, asleep at Eleanor's house. Nannies were feeding them. Strangers were holding them. She thought about the 2 hours she got to see them each week, always supervised, always being judged. It was never enough time. For a brief second, she considered just giving up completely. Her phone suddenly buzzed, pulling her away from the darkness. The call was from an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. What was the point? It was probably more bad news. Another lawyer saying her case was hopeless. Another person reminding her that men like Garrett always win. She was just a guest in his world. But something made her swipe her thumb and answer the call. "Am I speaking with Meredith Caldwell?" a woman asked. Her voice was cautious and strange. It had a faint echo, like she was calling from a big, empty room. "Who's calling?" Meredith asked. "My name is not important at the moment," the woman said, "but I have some information I think you will want to see. Look, if you're another reporter looking for a scoop, I am not going to talk. I have said all I am going to say. "I am not a reporter, Mrs. Caldwell," the woman answered. "I am someone who has been exactly where you are now. I am someone who survived Garrett Caldwell." Meredith felt like she could not breathe. She gripped the phone so hard, her knuckles turned white. "What are you talking about?" she whispered into the phone. There was a short pause. When the woman spoke again, her voice was much softer, heavy with the weight of old pain. "Check your email. I sent you something that will change everything for you. But you need to be extremely careful. He has people watching you. He always has people watching." "How do you have my number? Who are you?" Meredith demanded. "I am someone who refused to let him erase me," the woman said. "Look at the email, then you can call me back." The call ended. Meredith sat perfectly still. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking as she opened her email. A new message was at the top. It had no subject line and no text in the body. There was only a single attachment and one sentence that said, "He did this to me too. You are not going crazy. You are not alone." She tapped to open the file. The first thing she saw was a medical document from 4 years ago. It was an order to commit a woman named Colleen Mercer to a mental health facility. Her husband, Garrett Mercer, had her admitted. He claimed she was deeply depressed and imagining things that were not real. It was an involuntary commitment. Meredith's heart froze. Garrett had been married before. Eleanor had told her that once. She mentioned it very briefly at a family dinner years ago. She said it was a short marriage that ended when his first wife tragically died in a car accident. It was just so sad, Eleanor had said at the time. But some people are just not built to handle this world. But Colleen Mercer did not die in a car accident. These documents proved that her husband had locked her away in a psychiatric hospital. She was held there for 6 months. They gave her medication and isolated her from the world. She was finally released after she signed legal papers. She had to give up all her marital assets and promise to never contact Garrett or his family again. After she signed, she simply vanished. Meredith swiped through the rest of the documents, feeling sicker with each page. She saw medical records for procedures Colleen never consented to. She saw financial statements for hidden bank accounts. There were legal filings that had been buried and sealed by a judge. And then she found a letter from Colleen to her sister. It was a digital copy that had never been sent. It said, "He convinced everyone I was insane. He found doctors to back up his lies, judges who owed him favors, and lawyers who would do anything for his money. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had stolen everything. He took my money, my reputation, my freedom, and my identity. If you are reading this, it means I finally escaped. Please do not let him do this to anyone else." Meredith stared at the date on the documents. It was 4 years in the past. Colleen Mercer had gotten away from Garrett Caldwell. She had survived. She had rebuilt her life from the ashes of the one he had destroyed. And that meant Meredith could do the same thing. She picked up her phone and dialed the unknown number. The woman answered on the very first ring. "I am listening," Meredith said. For the first time in what felt like forever, her voice was steady and strong. "Tell me everything," Meredith said. The woman on the phone now called herself Catherine. It was a name she had picked for her new beginning. She had left the name Colleen Mercer behind, along with everything else that her ex-husband, Garrett, had ruined. She explained that she now lived a quiet life, tucked away in a small town in Oregon where nobody knew her past. It took her 4 long years to put the pieces of her life back together, to learn how to trust again, and to stop constantly looking over her shoulder. But she never forgot what Garrett did to her. When she heard on the news that his new wife had run away with their children, she knew she could not stay silent any longer. "I have been collecting evidence against him for years," Catherine said, her voice full of a calm strength. I have proof of everything, but I was always too afraid to go to the authorities by myself. Meredith asked the question that was on her mind. So why call me now? Catherine's response was straightforward. Because you were the first one who ever really fought him. The other women, they just disappeared. I hoped that if we worked together, we might finally be able to stop him for good. That night, they talked on the phone for 3 straight hours. Catherine described the incredible amount of evidence she had gathered. She showed how Garrett repeated his abusive behavior and used his network of powerful friends to protect himself. Then she revealed something that made Meredith's blood run cold. There was another woman before me, Catherine admitted. Her name was Patricia. After 2 years of marriage, he had her committed, and before Patricia, there was a girl he dated in college. She dropped out of school without a word and moved away, never explaining why. Meredith felt her stomach clench. How many women are there? Catherine paused for a moment. The ones I can confirm? At least 4. But I won't wait online data. I am certain that there are more, she added. Meredith felt physically ill. All these years, so many women had been hurt while Garrett walked away without any consequences. His money had created a system that allowed his cruelty to continue. What is our plan? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We go to the one person who has wanted to bring him down for years. 2 days after that phone call, Meredith was in a simple government building in Hartford. She was there to meet a woman named Patricia Cole, an FBI agent with sharp, tired eyes that told you nothing could surprise her. Agent Cole looked directly at Meredith and said, Mrs. Caldwell, for 6 years, I have been trying to build a case against your husband. I have investigated him for everything from securities fraud to tax evasion and even obstruction of justice. But every time I get close, something happens. My witnesses disappear, or they suddenly change their minds. Critical evidence simply vanishes. And somehow, judges always seem to rule in his favor. Meredith needed to be certain. She asked, So you are sure that he is guilty? The agent's reply was grim. I am sure he is a very dangerous man who has extremely powerful friends. Then why is he not in jail? Agent Cole leaned closer. Because there is a big difference between knowing something is true and being able to prove it in a court of law. To do that, I need people who are willing to speak up. And so far, no one has been brave enough, Meredith said, finishing the agent's thought. She thought about her 2 beautiful children, Emmett and Nora, and the painfully short 2 hours she was allowed with them each week. She imagined Eleanor, her mother-in-law, smiling with smug satisfaction. She saw her husband's girlfriend, Vanessa, with her hand resting on her pregnant belly. A fire began to burn inside of Meredith. I am not scared anymore, she announced with new determination. For the next 3 weeks, they worked tirelessly to build their case. Agent Cole and Catherine, another victim, pieced together a decade's worth of crimes. Meredith even agreed to wear a hidden recording device during her visits with the children, capturing conversations that showed the world who Garrett really was. The plan they created was incredibly clever because of its simplicity. Meredith would be the one to call Garrett. She would pretend to be completely broken and ask for a private meeting to talk about giving up. She knew his enormous ego would not let him refuse the chance to see her surrender. He would arrive expecting to gloat over a defeated woman begging for mercy, but instead of a broken woman, he was about to walk directly into a perfectly designed trap. They scheduled the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at a hotel suite in Stamford. Meredith chose the room herself, making sure it offered perfect acoustics and had many places to hide tiny cameras. She arrived early, her heart pounding inside her chest, but her mind felt sharp and focused. In the adjoining suite next door, Agent Cole and her team were already set up, listening to every single sound. When Garrett walked in, he was exactly as she remembered him, dressed impeccably, radiating an aura of supreme confidence, as if he were completely untouchable. You wanted to see me, he said. It was not a question, but a command. He settled into a large armchair, with the relaxed pride of a man who had never lost a single battle in his life. "Go ahead. Talk." Meredith sat across from him. She squeezed her hands together in her lap to stop them from trembling. "I want to be with my children," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I miss them more than anything." A cold, cruel smile appeared on his face. "Then you need to end this ridiculous fight. Come back home and learn to know your place." "My place?" she repeated quietly. He let out a soft laugh. It was the exact same smile that had once convinced her she was the most fortunate woman alive. Now, she finally saw its true nature. It was the mask of a predator. "You were never going to be more than what I made you," he explained in a chilling tone. "A pretty thing on my arm, a good mother to my children, and a wife who understood the importance of silence. But then you got greedy, Mary. You wanted things you never earned, like a little respect, or a little control. And control is the one thing I will never, ever give away." Meredith could feel the tiny microphone pressed against her skin, recording every single one of his poisonous words. "What about Colleen?" she asked softly. "Did she want control too?" The look on his face changed in an instant. The confident smile disappeared completely. It was replaced by something sinister and terrifying. "Where did you hear that name?" he hissed. "I know everything about her, Garrett. I know what you did to her." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Colleen was a pathetic woman, just like you. She refused to accept her role in the world, so I had to make her go away. If you keep pushing me, I promise you will disappear in the exact same way." "Are you threatening me?" she asked. "I am making you a promise," he answered. Meredith gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then she looked right into the large mirror on the far wall, knowing a camera was hidden just behind it. "I think we have everything we need," she said, her voice loud and clear. The door to the suite suddenly burst open. A flood of FBI agents poured into the room. For the first time in his entire pampered life, Garrett Caldwell looked absolutely, completely terrified. His arrest became the biggest news story in the entire country. Every news channel showed the video on a constant loop. Garrett being escorted from the Stamford Hotel in handcuffs, his face a wild mix of total shock and pure rage. Those images were everywhere. They were debated on every morning show and shared millions of times across the internet. The headlines were sensational. "Billionaire hedge fund manager arrested on federal charges," "The FBI takedown of a Wall Street tyrant," and "More women come forward in the Caldwell scandal." The official list of charges filed against him was incredibly long and very serious. It went from securities fraud and tax evasion to conspiracy to violate civil rights. When Catherine finally told her story publicly, followed by Patricia and two other women Meredith did not even know, the case exploded. It became something much bigger than just one man's terrible crimes. It became a moment of reckoning for everyone. Agent Cole had warned Meredith that the legal process would be slow and challenging. She reminded her that Garrett's army of expensive lawyers would use every trick to fight them at every turn. But some justice arrived very quickly, long before any trial was scheduled to begin. Just 3 days after Garrett's arrest, his girlfriend Vanessa Holt was stopped at the airport. She was trying to get on a private plane headed for the Cayman Islands. She was carrying $200,000 worth of jewelry and a designer bag filled with cash. She was arrested for being in possession of stolen property. She was then walked through the crowded airport terminal wearing the very same expensive shoes she had worn to the custody hearing. Her police booking photo, with black mascara running down her tear-stained cheeks and her eyes wide with terror, was printed right next to Garrett's in all the news reports. And what about that pregnancy she had so proudly used against Meredith? It turned out to be a complete fabrication. Hospital records confirmed that Vanessa had faked the whole thing to trap a wealthy man who was now a national disgrace. Meanwhile, Eleanor Caldwell barricaded herself inside her massive mansion, refusing to talk to the press or anyone else. Her busy social calendar was suddenly empty. The powerful friends who used to beg for her dinner party invitations were now not even answering her phone calls. The Caldwell family name, which was once a sign of elite status and power, was now nothing more than a punchline and a warning to others. But for Meredith, there was only one victory that truly mattered. That victory came 6 weeks later. It happened in a courtroom that felt like a different universe from the one where she had so recently lost her children. A new judge named Patricia Winters was in charge of the hearing. She had a reputation for being serious and fair. She went through all of the new evidence with great care. She listened to the powerful testimony from Agent Cole, Catherine, and the other women. She watched the secret video from the hotel room, where Garrett openly threatened Meredith's life. And then she announced her final decision. This court hereby grants full custody of the minor children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell, to their mother, Meredith Caldwell. Mr. Garrett Caldwell is to have no visitation or contact whatsoever until his criminal trials are concluded. Additionally, this court orders the immediate release of all frozen marital assets and awards financial compensation for the emotional distress inflicted upon the petitioner. The words sounded like they were from a beautiful dream. Full custody. Her money was free. She was awarded damages. She had done it. She had actually won. Her lawyer, Suzanne, squeezed her hand so hard that it almost hurt. Meredith could hear the low murmur of conversations from the people sitting behind her in the courtroom, but she was not paying attention to them. Her eyes were fixed on the courtroom door, where a court officer was leading two small children who were wearing identical sweaters. Emmett was the first one to see her. A huge, joyful smile lit up his face, and he immediately started to struggle in the officer's arms, reaching his little hands out for her. "Mama Rut," he yelled at the top of his lungs. "Mama." It was the very first word he had ever spoken. He repeated it over and over like it was a happy song. "Mama, mama, mama." In what felt like a single second, Meredith was all the way across the room. She gathered both of her children into her arms as a huge sob of pure relief shook her entire body. Nora hid her face against her mother's shoulder, her tiny hands getting tangled up in her hair. "I am right here," Meredith whispered into their ears as happy tears streamed down her cheeks. "I am right here, my sweet babies, and I promise I am never, ever going to let you go again." The months that followed were not always easy because real healing takes a long time. Meredith and her children moved to a quiet little town on the coast of Maine. It was a place far away from the dark memories of Greenwich. She was able to buy a small, charming house with a lovely view of the ocean. It was not nearly as large as the mansion she had left behind, but this house belonged only to her. She also went back to work, putting her accounting skills to use by helping other women discover hidden assets in their own divorce cases. Her life after the divorce was simple. The money she earned from her new job was nothing like the fortune Garrett's hedge fund had provided, but her work now had a real purpose. Her twins, Emmett and Nora, began to grow up as children should. They took their very first steps together on a sandy beach while the sun was setting. They spoke their first full sentences to each other while they were surrounded by unpacked boxes in their new living room. This was a home where they learned how to laugh and how to cry and how to feel completely safe. It was a place where no one ever raised their voice or slammed a door, and a place where their mother never had to cry anymore. But Meredith still had nightmares. She would always check the locks on her doors 3 times before she went to bed. And she would still feel a jolt of panic if she smelled expensive cologne on a man walking past her. Every now and then, she would think she saw Garrett's face in a passing crowd. But she was getting better. It was a very slow and imperfect journey, but she never gave up. Then one lovely afternoon in the early spring, she was sitting on her porch. She was watching Emmett and Nora run around on the beach, happily chasing the seagulls. A pickup truck pulled into her driveway, and a man carrying a toolbox climbed out. His name was Owen Hartley. He was a local carpenter who had lost his own wife. He had kind eyes, and his hands were rough from years of hard work. He also had a young daughter named Sophie, who was the same age as her twins. He had come to fix the railing on her porch, which had been wobbly since the day she moved in. Owen never questioned her about where she came from. He did not ask for explanations or try to dig into her story. He simply repaired the loose porch railing and then spent a full hour chasing her children through the sand. Before leaving, he asked if he might be able to stop by again. "I would really like that," Meredith said, and the words felt completely true in her heart. Just then, her phone vibrated with a breaking news notification. Her eyes scanned the headline, which said, "Garrett Caldwell receives a sentence of 12 years in federal prison." She felt a complete and total void of emotion. Meredith powered down the phone, and her gaze returned to her children, to the rolling waves, and to the gentle man who offered a warm smile as he packed his tools away. An old thought surfaced in her mind. He stole everything from me. Garrett had shattered her trust and destroyed her feeling of safety. He had taken away her faith that the world could be a fair place. But he was never able to take her children, and he certainly could not break her spirit. From his truck, Owen waved one last time. A little girl, his daughter Sophie, had her face pressed to the glass, her small hand waving wildly at the twins. At that moment, Emmett came sprinting up the sandy path, his little shoes kicking up dust. "Mommy!" he yelled, his voice filled with discovery. "Mommy, look what I found!" He held out a simple seashell like it was the most valuable jewel in the world, his face lit up with absolute delight. Something shifted deep inside Meredith's heart right then. It was not a loud feeling of joy, but a quiet, powerful sense of calm. It was peace. She wrapped her arms around her son and gave his sandy cheek a loving kiss. "Oh, my love, it is beautiful," she whispered. "Let us go see if we can find some more." Hand in hand, the two of them walked down toward the shoreline. The waves were gently rolling in, washing the sand clean. The future seemed to open up in front of them, as vast and endless as the ocean itself. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Meredith Caldwell felt no fear at all.